Hey everyone, thanks for joining me, and today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about zombies. Yes, zombies. There sure are a lot of them in video games, aren't there? I'm going to be talking about the science of zombies, specifically, what's probably going on with them, and if zombies could actually occur in real life. Before I begin, let's delve a bit into the history of zombies. So, initially, the origin story for the zombie is, of course, the voodoo zombie, which comes from certain Haitian traditions. It was held that magic, certain rituals would turn people into this sort of mindless drone that would follow the orders of whoever cast the spell. But of course, they were popularized mainly and brought into the pop cultural consciousness by George Romero. And there's been several different kinds of zombies throughout the years. Originally, the most famous depiction of them is, of course, rising from the grave, coming back from the dead. And there was a certain point in our pop culture history where that was really, really terrifying. But I think once we realized that that's pretty unlikely to happen, it became more, I guess, science fiction based. Then came, like, the Cold War era, with worries about nuclear holocaust and radiation, came the radioactive zombie. And that was popular for a bit, I suppose, and until we kind of figured out that radiation, surprise, surprise, does not actually turn you into a zombie, it just gives you cancer. And I wouldn't try and use it to gain superpowers either. Probably a bad idea. Nowadays, of course, the most famous depiction of the zombie is probably the viral zombie. Someone turned into a zombie by some form of virus. So, with that said, we'll go into the different kinds of zombies and of viruses and possible infections a bit later. But right now, let's get a bit into the what's going on at the brain of the zombie. So, the distinguishing characteristic behind zombies is the fact that they eat people, right? That they eat flesh. They have this pathological urge to eat flesh, even like far past the point of satiation. So, what is that? What's going on there? Well, probably due to the degradation that's going on in the brain. The hypothalamus has stopped functioning correctly. And the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system and has a variety of functions, some of which controls fatigue and sleep and body temperature, and also your sense of hunger. It has been shown that people with damage to their hypothalamus will keep eating and drinking far past the point of satiation. Far past the point where they're actually full. So, another key thing about zombies is that they're often portrayed as not really responding to pain. Like, you can shoot them multiple times, and they'll just kind of keep coming at you until you hit them in the head. Probably the most logical explanation for this is the degradation of the nerves that carry pain signals to the brain, or the degradation of the thalamus, which is responsible for interpreting pain signals. Another zombie trope is the strange, sort of lumbering, staggering way that they walk. As a movement disorder, it's probably caused by damage to the cerebral spinal system, either damage to the spinal column itself or the damage to the cerebellum, which is largely responsible for balance and, of course, would impact movement if damaged. Traditionally, it is, of course, depicted that zombies don't possess memories. They don't really have memories of their former life. Obviously, some stories kind of play around with this. Usually, the traditional depiction of a zombie not recognizing someone, one of their loved ones, and then like eating them, it would probably be indicative of the fact that their hippocampus has stopped working correctly, as the hippocampus seems to be involved in the formation and control of memories. It also controls the autonomic nervous system, so if they don't breathe, if a zombie doesn't breathe in the traditional sense, or they don't react to light, their pupils don't dilate, or their heart rate, it doesn't really pump blood in a normal fashion, that's probably something to do with damage to the hippocampus as well. Or, well, maybe not the hippocampus itself, but definitely the limbic system, which it is a part of. And of course, if they're the sorts of zombies that you might see in 28 Days Later, or Resident Evil 4 or 5, which is to say, fairly fast-moving, seems to have many of their faculties still, but highly aggressive. That could have something to do with a malfunctioning amygdala, which is often said to be sort of the emotion center of the brain, and tends to be where emotions like rage, anger, or fear are first registered at. Though it's probably more complicated than just saying that fear lives in the amygdala, mind you. That's an oversimplification. But it is interesting that zombies, on some level, experience rage or anger or aggressive impulses, but they don't really seem to experience fear, especially seeing as fear, the instinct for self-preservation, is probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, emotion to develop and is deep-seated in the brain. And finally, of course, it's known that most zombies can't speak. They don't possess the ability to use language anymore. So why is that? Well, that probably has something to do with damage to the frontal left hemisphere of the brain, the area of the brain that contains Broca's area, often thought to be linked to language processing and the use of language. There is a disorder known as Broca's aphasia, which affects the use of language. And oftentimes, and people with it have a hard time speaking or generating syntactically correct sentences. This, by the way, is in contrast to Wernicke's aphasia, which would be the inability to understand language in a written or spoken form. So if they're unable to be communicated with, so in theory, zombies, even though they can't speak, they should be able to understand language. But if they apparently just can't be communicated with all, it must mean that they have damage to both areas of the brain. So now that we've gone over some of the symptoms of the zombie virus, let's go ahead and talk about the contagion itself. How does that spread? How would a zombie apocalypse or zombie pandemic occur? Alright, well, clearly, the type of virus is going to affect the way it disperses. It's going to impact how quickly it spreads throughout an area and what sort of quarantine or isolation procedures could be used to stop it. If the zombie virus is spread simply through bites, probably that's probably not something that's going to spread very quickly. Things like rabies have a pretty low dispersal rate because they can fairly effectively be isolated. Now, the spread of an airborne virus could indeed prove much more problematic. So I think in fiction, it's usually some sort of airborne virus, right? It's usually, if it's going to create a pandemic, it's probably going to have a very, very high dispersal rate. That said, we don't really know of any airborne viruses that cause zombie-like symptoms. Probably the closest analog we have that would create zombie-like symptoms is the rabies virus. But again, that is transmitted usually by direct contact, so it's... And it usually... And furthermore, it has a long incubation period, so that is to say that the time from infection to manifestation of symptoms of the rabies virus, by the time you manifest symptoms, there's really nothing that can be done. It's more or less 100% fatal at that point. But because of its long incubation period, it can be treated fairly effectively. You've usually got at least a few days to seek treatment, if not more than that. Though that said, if you're bitten by what you suspect to be a rabid animal, don't wait around. Like, go to the hospital immediately, because they're gonna get you in that lineup for treatment as soon as possible. Really, ideally. So as long as the rabies virus does not mutate into an airborne pathogen, we're probably pretty safe. So that's the viral scenario. But are there any other ways a zombie could be created and a pandemic could spread? Possibly. For one, let's talk about prions. Prions aren't strictly alive per se, and of course, technically neither are viruses or viri. They're actually systems of protein particles that are infectious, and if they get into your body, can cause really, really terrible neurodegenerative diseases. Those are fun, right? Probably the best known examples of the sorts of diseases caused by prions are Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is essentially a disease that attacks the central nervous system and turns your brain into this wholly spongy material, and you die. Not a good way to go, really. There's treatment for it, but it can't be cured. And the other example is Kuru, which is only found in Papua New Guinea thus far, and it's the result of cannibalistic funeral practices. The eating of the brain material tends to be the most infectious part of it. And, well, I'm not going to say anything more about that. You can look that up if you want. But if there were prions that spread, that caused, and let's say, like the food supply, that caused rabies-like or zombie-like diseases, then that could be one way a zombie pandemic could occur. Probably not. Probably pretty unlikely to happen, however. In terms of other things that could cause people to freak out and chew on people, one of them is, of course, drugs. Yeah, I know that's a pretty simple answer, but yeah, drugs. If any of you remember, a few years back, there was, in Florida, because, of course, it's Florida, there was a guy who was under the influence of a drug being called bath salts, and he ended up chewing a man's face off, pretty much. So, yeah, that's a thing, if somehow a bunch of these drugs or hallucinogenic agents got into the water supply or was dispersed by air, that could cause a zombie apocalypse of sorts. Again, fairly unlikely, though. Would have to be pretty intentional. And there's one other thing that could produce zombies of sorts. Let's talk about parasites. Mind-controlling parasites. You might have seen these in The Last of Us with the cordyceps fungus. Yes, Cordyceps unilateralis, a species of fungus found in rainforests in Brazil, I believe, and actually takes over ants and forces it to do its bidding. They just have them march around and spread spores, essentially. So, zombified ants, that's a thing. There's also a species of wasp that injects its eggs or lays its eggs inside caterpillars. And then I assume you guys are familiar with Alien, the xenomorphs or facehuggers, and then what happens after that. Yeah, that's pretty much what happens to the caterpillars. Now, in terms of the possibility of a fungus taking over the human brain, well, thankfully the human brain is significantly more complex than an ant brain, so, I mean, worker ants might not even be, sentient in our common vernacular. They're already sort of drones, so they're significantly easier to take over. It would have to be, to take over the human brain, it would have to be something much more specialized. It would have to find, some way to negotiate the complex mass of synapses and neurons that exist in our heads. So that's one barrier that it would have to get over. And I mean, we humans have actually been pretty good at exploiting funguses to do our work for us. Penicillin? Anyone? Yeah, that's so. By the time that starts to happen, we can probably engineer our way out of it. However, that's not to say that there's not parasites that affect the human brain. There is a protozoan called Toxoplasmosa gondii, and what it does is it infects mice, and the infected mice are no longer afraid of cats. They approach them without fear and usually often get eaten by them. Why do they do this? Because Toxoplasmosa gondii is one of the few places it can reproduce is in the digestive tracts of cats. So it actually rewires the mouse brain to kill itself and then get into the cat's digestive system where it can reproduce. Now, what does this have to do with humans? Well, it might not have escaped your notice that this protozoan lives in the digestive lining of our frequent house pets, and they have indeed transferred themselves to humans. Currently in the US, it's thought that about between 20 to 25% of the population is infected with toxoplasmosis, which is the disease caused by toxoplasmosa. And normally it's not a big deal, there's not a whole lot of symptoms that manifest itself from it. However, it is theorized that it might affect the human brain in some way. That particularly in women, it might predispose them to owning cats. It might predispose them to want to own a cat and take care of many cats. There's some slight indication that it might on occasion affect the disposition of some people. Their emotions in rare circumstances. Nothing super conclusive at this point. Just some theories and some studies. Although, however, it does seem that people infected by toxoplasmosa are less likely to dislike the smell of cat urine. Some of them might actually find it pleasant. Which is, yeah, that's weird. Anyway, back to zombies. We might have parasites that are impacting our brains in some way right now, at this very moment. It's probably not anything to worry about at the moment, but if some sort of parasite that caused worse symptoms were to evolve and get into humans, well, anyway, that about does it for this talk about zombies, except I did want to bring up one thing. In the Dead Space series, the necromorphs could be loosely thought of as space zombies. Well, a professor at San Francisco State University by the name of Stephen Kane published a paper called A Necrobiological Explanation for the Fermi Paradox. Now, the Fermi Paradox, for those of you who don't know, is given the statistical likelihood that we are not alone in the universe, and in fact the galaxy we live in should have plenty of other habitable planets, where is everyone? Like, why haven't we been contacted by them? Why isn't there any sign of alien life out there? Well, Kane's argument is that some of these planets have been infected with spontaneous necroanimation psychosis. What does that mean? Well, think about it like this. Over the time the Earth has existed, we've seen all sorts of crazy diseases evolve, like rabies, smallpox, influenza, of course, and the Black Plague, which wiped out much of the human population. Well, the chances of similar diseases involving other planets is pretty good, right? And given all the planets that might exist out there, there's also the chance of some sort of plague that creates a zombie apocalypse. And according to his calculations, within only 100 parsecs of Earth, which is about 300 light years, there are more than 2,500 planets that have been infected. There are more than 2,500 planets that have experienced some sort of zombie pandemic. Now, based on the likelihood of intelligent life out there in the universe somewhere, again, the Fermi Paradox states that we should have probably made contact with someone already, but given the fact that one alien civilization might visit an infected planet and then pick up an infection that they spread to other planets, well, the cause of all that empty space out there might be space zombies? It's a pretty interesting paper, actually. Take a look at it if you want. I'll see if I can't link to it in the description of the video. Alright, so that about does it. I hope you've learned something today about the zombies and the chances of a zombie apocalypse. If you like this video, subscribe, do all that stuff. Check out my other videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.